This is my favorite time of day to be with my roses. Early morning at Garden Valley Ranch. It's the best time to look at them, too, when they're fresh from a good night's rest. You know, people ask me if there's any truth to the rumor that neighbors have seen me talking to my roses. I tell them it's the gospel truth. I talk to them all the time. I'm not the first to fall head over heels in love with roses, of course, nor the first to try to find the right words to describe just what it is that makes roses so special, so spellbinding. Welcome to Garden Valley Ranch. My name is Rayford Reddell, and the subject is roses. I didn't always grow roses at a rose ranch. I used to just have a garden. But then when I filled it to overflowing and still longed for more roses, I had no choice but to go commercial. Now at Garden Valley Ranch, we have 6,000 garden rose bushes planted in an open field for the sale of their blossoms to the floral trade. You're going to be seeing lots of Garden Valley Ranch in the next few minutes. And I want you to know that every single piece of advice we offer is exactly what we practice here. During my years of learning to grow good roses, I made lots of mistakes, more than I care to admit to. But I wrote them all down and figured out solutions. And that's what this video is all about, the secrets to growing good roses. There are some characters who are important to this ranch you should get to know. The first is Bob Gallion, the foreman, the man who keeps this place blossoming.
Don't forget to mention Sadie, Ray.
Oh yes, Sadie, our beloved German shorthair, diligently patrols the place. Sadie also knows a good rose from a dud. Finally, there's another one of our pets you'll be hearing from, Margot, an African gray parrot. Margot talks and whistles a lot. In fact, you'll probably hear her let out a cat call or two. She also tries to sing. For instance, she sings, "Everything's coming up, Ro." Margot has a problem with roses, but I don't, and neither will you if you pick up on some of our tips. If you've never seen one, this is what a bare root rose bush looks like. I know it's not very promising, looks even dead, but I assure you it's only dormant, waiting for spring. The best thing to do is to plant it as soon as you get it. If you can't plant a bare root rose bush because of bad weather, you can do one of two things. The easiest is to wrap the roots in moist newspaper, then put the entire bush in a plastic bag and store it in the coolest, darkest closet you have. If you need to store your rose longer, you'll have to do what rosarians call heeling in. Dig a trench at least a foot deep and lay in the bushes at 45-degree angles, and then cover everything up to the crown. It's okay to leave canes poking out as long as no freeze is likely, in which case you should cover the canes with plastic or other protective material. There are certain anatomical features of a rose bush with which you'll want to familiarize yourself. The most important one is here, the bud union, which is the heart of the rose bush. These are main canes. The smaller ones growing off the main canes are called laterals. This long piece of wood is the shank. These are the major roots, the larger ones. Roses don't have tap roots. And these smaller ones are called feeder roots. Here's a graphic illustration of the anatomy of a rose bush. Of all the gardeners I wish I'd met, I'd have certainly liked to have known the man who said he'd rather plant a 2-bit rose in a 4-bit hole than vice versa. Nothing you ever do for a rose is as important as the care you offer in preparing its home. Okay, let's start with the 4-bit hole. These days, actually, it'll cost more like $4. The ideal hole, like the one here that Bob is digging, is about 18 inches or so deep and up to 2 feet wide. While we're talking about soil, let's discuss the kind roses like. I should tell you first of all that if your soil is mostly clay, you should bite the bullet and get rid of it and fill the hole with something that will make the roses happier. If you're lucky enough to have anything like this, good garden loam, mix it with equal portions of aged manure and any organic material like compost or peat moss. What we use here at Garden Valley Ranch is a combination of compost and aged turkey manure. Now that we have a hole and something to fill it with, there's one more important thing to consider before we plant, and that is to make certain that the hole drains properly. We're going to fill this hole with water and see what happens. If it doesn't drain within an hour, we're going to have to dig deeper and add some gravel to improve the drainage. Okay, Bob, I think we're ready to plant Dolly Parton now. That's the rose, not the singer. What Bob is going to do first is build a cone of soil in the bottom of the hole. While Bob is playing in the dirt, let's get back to our rose bush. Before you plant your bare root bushes, you should soak them in water. You should also add a little household bleach. Here, Bob's adding about a 1/4 cup per 5-gallon container. Some rosarians add a little liquid fertilizer or vitamin B1. I think it's a good idea. After you soak your bushes for at least 2 hours, better yet overnight, nip off any broken or damaged roots with sharp shears. These canes have dead tips that need to come off. They're also too long. The landmark you look for in planting a bare root rose bush is the bud union, here. This bulbous swelling is where roses are budded onto their rootstock. You might say the bud union is the heart of the rose bush because it's the point from which all new canes grow. How high you plant your rose bushes above soil level depends on where you garden and how much mulch you plan to add. Because our winters aren't severe and because we're big believers in mulch, we place bud unions 2 inches above soil level. A shovel handle placed like this one over the soil cone gives you a good gauge for determining the final placement of your bush. Now that we have the bush in place, you can see the reason for the cone. These roots are going to rest firmly on top of the soil, like this. Once the bush is in place, begin refilling the hole and be sure to use your hands, not your feet, to pat the soil in place. That looks good, Bob. Now that our rose is settled in its new home, we're going to give it a drink, a thorough soaking, in fact. This next step is an absolute must. Unless you mound newly planted rose bushes, they get parched by winter winds. We mound our new bushes to at least half their height, about like this, and then water them again. You may now turn your back to a happy, well-planted rose bush. If it doesn't rain, you'll have to water the mounds and their adjacent areas where the roots are, but don't remove the mounds until strong new growth appears. Now let's take a look at our bush some months later, and Bob will show you the right way to unmound.
The important thing about unmounding a bush is to be careful about removing the mulch from the center of the bush so that you don't damage any of the new growth. So what I do is I start out by removing the stuff from the outside, pushing it back away from the bush, being real careful as I get closer to the center of the bush, the bud union, for fear of damaging any of that new growth. And then when I get up to about the center like this, I take a water wand and begin to just sort of gently wash away the material, the mulching material. Unfortunately, on this one, there's no new growth there, but the bud union has certainly stayed nice and moist.
Now we're going to talk about some specific varieties of roses, not merely their growth habits, but also their blooming characteristics. This rose is not only a hybrid tea, but it was also voted the world's favorite red rose. It's called Mr. Lincoln. It blooms on long cutting stems, and it is deliciously fragrant. My favorite hybrid tea is Color Magic, not only because it is wondrously perfumed, but also because of its appealing combination of colors. A fine hybrid tea that is clear pink is Bewitched. Its blossoms open to be the size of dinner plates, and they are deliciously perfumed. A rose that has no perfume whatsoever, but is still a fine hybrid tea, is Touch of Class. It is exemplary in its form. This rose is called Double Delight. It is not only fragrant, but it is distinguished by the fact that no two blooms are exactly alike. The subject now is feeding. We've already talked about the fact that roses are insatiably thirsty, but they're also incurably hungry. That's no surprise if you consider that modern roses bloom over an extended period of time, and they need meals every now and then if they're expected to throw out that many blossoms. Any package of fertilizer that you ever purchase will have 3 numbers on it. The first number tells the content of nitrogen. The second one is phosphorus, and the third is potassium. If a fertilizer is well balanced, the 3 numbers will be even. If a fertilizer is concentrated in one of the numbers, then it will be the highest in the series. In this particular one, you can see that there is 5 times more nitrogen than there is either of the 2 other elements. This fertilizer has, you will see, the same concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus, but only half as much potassium. The brand of fertilizer that you use is not important. What is important is that you concentrate on the right elements. For instance, at the beginning of the year, when you want to get your bushes off and going, you concentrate on the first element, nitrogen. It also makes no difference whether you use a water-soluble product or a liquid product. Your roses will not know the difference. My best advice is buy what's on sale. Oh, by the way, one other thing, never use more fertilizer than the manufacturer specifies on the label. If you have any hope of growing roses with stems as long as these, you have to feed them regularly. But just as important as the fertilizer you use is how you apply it. The correct procedure calls for spreading fertilizer around the drip line of the bush. The drip line is that imaginary circle that would be formed if the bush were soaking wet and dripping water. You can see that Bob is using a measuring cup here to make certain that he is applying the right amount of fertilizer. It's also difficult to stick to the absolute principles of a drip line because this bush is so large that it's growing into the path. The process would be the same if you were using a liquid fertilizer. Just keep in mind this imaginary circle and try to apply the fertilizer there. Anytime you apply dry fertilizers around the drip line of a rose bush, you must water them in thoroughly. You want to get them down to the level where they'll do some good. I'd like to sing the praises of mulch for a minute. Mulch is nothing more than organic material layered over the ground where plants grow. Roses absolutely love it. Mulch makes three important contributions. First of all, it retains moisture so that the roots remain cool. Secondly, it controls weeds. That's welcome news to any gardener. And third, it releases its nutrients every time it is irrigated over the course of the growing season. The particular mulch you use isn't nearly as important as the fact that you use something organic to mulch your beds. Most nurseries carry a wide selection of mulch. Many of them have redwood or other fir bark shavings. They all carry manure, and I'm a great believer in making a manure at least a part of the mulch. Also, it is much better to use fowl manures than it is either steer or cow manure. Just make certain that the manure has been aged. If manure is fresh, it will burn the young feeder roots. We're fortunate in that we live near a mushroom farm, and mushroom compost is made of all the materials that roses love. We also live near a turkey farm, and the farmer delivers aged turkey manure to us that is pure gold for roses. As a last word on mulch, let me just say something about raised beds. If you have the slightest question about the drainage in your garden, you should consider raised beds. Not only will they ensure good drainage, but they'll also provide space for that carpet of mulch we were talking about. We're going to talk about some floribundas now. As their name would suggest, floribunda roses are those that contain many flowers on one spray. Even more technically, a floribunda rose ideally should present roses at all stages of development on one stem, unlike grandifloras, where the roses are to be at the same stage of development. This rose, called Sexy Rexy, is a fairly newcomer to the floribunda scene, but as you can see, it is exemplary in its form. On one spray, we have roses in tight bud and also those that are fully open. There are several other floribundas you might want to consider for planting in your garden. One of them is iceberg. It's considered by many people to be the finest rose in the world. It has some terrific attributes, not the least of which is that it stays in bloom all season long and produces exemplary sprays of white roses on one stem. An old-timer among the floribundas is Europeana. It was hybridized in Holland, but made a big splash when it was introduced in this country. It is also a fire breather in competition. You will often see it on the table with a ribbon draped around its neck. And now we're going to have a look at Playboy. This is a particularly sassy new floribunda. Not only does it bloom all summer long, but it has wonderful, shiny, disease-resistant foliage. This rose, Purple Tiger, is a brand new introduction to the rose world. I predict that it's going to enjoy an incredible success because bicolors always do, especially when the colors are as unusual as this one. Now we're going to talk about another group of roses, and one that is distinctly different from the hybrid tea, particularly in its blooming characteristics. This is Queen Elizabeth, a grandiflora rose. As a matter of fact, many people believe Queen Elizabeth is the finest grandiflora in the world. Queen Elizabeth is a nice shade of pink, but what differentiates it mostly is the fact that it blooms in large sprays on incredibly long cutting stems. We're going to talk about a deep subject now, watering. With roses, the key isn't watering frequently, but watering deeply whenever you water. When you water deeply, water goes low into the ground and encourages strong root formation. If you water only at the surface, you will encourage only feeder roots. Back when I had only about 100 roses to take care of, I used a garden hose, which is probably what many of you will use unless you decide that you want to install an irrigation system. Here at Garden Valley Ranch, with 6,000 rose bushes to take care of, we obviously can't water them all with a garden hose, so we have installed an irrigation system. Bob, would you tell what this system we use is all about?
The system we use here at Garden Valley Ranch doesn't really have a name. If anything, I call it my 3/4 polytubing microstem system. The first thing you start with is your water source. I like the 3/4 polytubing because the diameter size of the pipe brings in plenty of water for a long bed. The other thing I like about this polytubing is that you can use it in a straight bed like we've used here, or you can also use it in a bed that's kind of curved in more of a natural landscape. The first step is that you roll out this polytubing down the center of the area where you have plants, and then I use pieces of wire that have been cut into like U-shapes so that it's held firmly to the ground. And then once you've got the pipe laying down, then you want to decide where you have your water sources coming out, and that's determined by where the plants are. First step is using this little tool which makes a punch hole in the polytubing. Punch it through, and then you're ready for your micro stem. And the stems come in, this one is a 12-inch stem, but you can get them in 8-inch as well. I like the 12-inch because we lay the polytubing down on the surface of the ground and then mulch the bed, so about 4 inches of this stem will be covered up and held in place by the compost. The end of the stem has a screwed-in section so that you can attach it to the polytubing by screwing it in. Then the stem, and at the top of the stem there are placed for different sizes of orifices for the amount of water you want to come out of the end of the stem. This particular one is green, and it allows, in this situation, for enough water to go from the edge of each side of the bed here. And at the top, above the orifice, is a cap. In this particular instance, it's a 360-degree cap, so that water comes out and does a 360-degree pattern. There are caps that are 180s, 60s, depending on wherever the space is you want to water. Once this is put down into the ground, then if you're not using compost at this particular time, then they have the stems that hold the stem into place in the ground, and that's the final step. Now, if you can imagine this being a completely installed system like this one, you can see how each of the components work and the importance of the stem height. This stem height is perfect because it's keeping the water from getting too much of the foliage on the rose bushes wet. If this were attached, then you'd have the water coming out more at this height, which would be the whole key to successful watering is keeping as much water off the foliage as possible, keeping the water down low. And that's why these stems work particularly well.
We're now going to begin with my least favorite subject on roses, spraying. If a hybridizer could come up with a rose that didn't contract mildew, rust, or black spot, the three big diseases known to roses, and never attracted aphids, thrips, or spider mites, I would happily dig up my roses and replant. But that day hasn't come along yet, and until it does, I choose to spray. The home gardener has a wide assortment of sprayers to consider. This is one that holds about 1.5 gallons of material. It has a convenient trigger handle pump on top. Here's another one that operates on the same principle, but it holds only about 1/2 gallon of material. Again, there is a pump and a trigger handle. You can even use the same sprayer you use to moisten clothes before ironing. And finally, the easiest of all are sprays in pressurized cans. You don't have to look the way Bob does here when you go out to spray your rose garden, as though you're about to invade Mars. But you must remember that we have 6,000 rose bushes to worry about. The sprayer Bob is using here is a backpack sprayer that holds about 4 gallons of spray material, enough for more than 100 rose bushes. It will do me no good to tell you specifically what spray to use, because chemical products keep changing names and getting yanked from garden shelves. What I can tell you precisely, however, is how to spray. Always begin spraying at the bottoms of rose bushes and spray upwards. As you spray, drifts will float down and cover the top sides of leaves. When you reach the top of the bush with upward sprays, one shot downward will finish the job. One last word about spraying, never too soon as far as I'm concerned. Anytime you use chemical sprays, you must follow the directions on the back of the container to the letter. It is also wise to afford yourself maximum protection by covering all body parts, wearing gloves, including goggles, not just while you're spraying, but also while you're mixing. If you run out of garden space, but still yearn for more roses, you might try what I did 2 years ago, and that is to install a colonnade that will take advantage of the vertical growth of climbing roses. I chose 6 varieties of climbers, both because their colors look good together and because they bloom over a long period of time and not at the same time. This one is Zéphirine Drouin, a member of the Bourbon family of roses, very fragrant. She's paired with the lovely Clematis henryi. Over here we have Shot Silk, one of the first to bloom. As you can tell, it's starting to go out, but it will repeat. And over here we have Madame Alfred Carrière, surely the most famous noisette rose in the world. Unlike plants like clematis, honeysuckle, ivies, or other plants that have tendrils for attaching themselves to what they grow over, roses have none, and you must do the early training. Eventually, when they cover an entire archway, they will use each other to attach themselves. As you can tell from this group of roses, we've done some early training by getting the main canes to travel horizontally. You can also see that there are hundreds of laterals climbing up from them. Those laterals, if you have a ladder tall enough to reach them, can of course be used for cut roses. This is the way we train roses on pergolas at Garden Valley Ranch. During their first year in the ground, we use supports like this wire that is connected to the top and bottom. But look what happens during the second year. Canes begin wrapping around each other, and by the time they reach the top, you can bet they'll go to town. This is another great way to train a climbing rose up a tree, or in this case, a tree stump. This Monterey cypress tree was planted in 1890, but 3 years ago it was felled by a windstorm. Rather than removing it all the way to the ground, I left the stump and planted the famous noisette rose, Alistair Stella Gray, to climb up it. And as you can see, Mr. Gray is very happy with his new home. Finally, here's another climber I can't resist showing you. These bushes of iceberg have been in the ground only 1 year, but as you can see for yourself, they're happy where they are. The red growth that you're seeing now is what rosarians pray for each spring. They're called basal breaks, and they develop into new main canes of each rose bush. To encourage them, besides using fertilizers that you would ordinarily apply, I suggest you consider adding a 1/4 cup of Epsom salts sprinkled around the base of each bush 4 times a year from April through July.
Now we're going to talk about disbudding. This is a stem of a rose called Double Delight, which is a hybrid tea. And you can see with the hybrid tea, what you want is one flower bud at the end of the stem. And what's happened here with this one is it sent out all of this extra side stuff. So when you do disbudding work, I always do it with my bare hands, without gloves, just because I need to really be able to have a good grip on what I'm doing. So I grab the stem someplace up toward the top, and then these side growths, these areas that become roses if we let them develop, you just snap them out. Just a gentle rocking action. You don't want to remove the leaflet, you just want to remove that's coming out above it. And you just work your way on up to the top bud. And if you do this early enough, then those scars will completely disappear by the time the rose blooms. There's even one little small one up at the top. Now that's perfectly disbudded. Let's do one more. There's another example over here that needs to be done. Just remember to hold the stem firmly between your thumb and your forefinger. Snap that right out. You can just drop those right into the bed. They're not going to do anything. And that's a perfectly disbudded hybrid tea. This is an example of disbudding a floribunda. This particular spray of roses here, by the way, this rose is iceberg, has gone too far. So what should have been done earlier on is that this central bud should have been removed. And that's what the spray should have developed into. You can get by with the rose like iceberg because the flowers are actually smaller, so there's not so much weight holding it down. But now here's another spray that, again, is a little farther past than it should in development, but it still is not too late to disbud it. So again, you want to grab the top of that stem between your thumb and your forefinger, and then just gently rock that out, and then that scar will be totally gone by the time these develop into flowers.
Miniature roses have been with us for about 100 years now, but during that century they have changed a great deal. When they were first introduced, the ideal miniature rose was supposed to fit under a teacup, bush and all. Now they've grown to be substantially larger. Many of them rival the size of floribundas. Here at Garden Valley Ranch, we have them planted in a long row with a collection of bourbon roses planted behind them. We grow some of the more popular varieties, including Minnie Pearl, Jean Keneally, Party Girl, Louis Decimero, Pace Setter, and Jennifer. The care you give miniature roses is much the same as that you would offer the other roses in your garden. There are some pluses, however. Miniature roses tend to be more disease resistant. They also travel very well out of water, meaning you can transport them more easily. Yet another plus of miniature roses is that you can fit them into garden spots where you can't place larger roses. Also, they work well in containers, meaning that you can occasionally bring them inside the house to enjoy. One thing you must stay on the prowl for with miniature roses is spider mites, what we call here the dread of August. Spider mites, however, can't stand water, so if you irrigate your bushes at their bases, you kill 2 birds with 1 stone. get rid of the spider mites and soak the mulch that will leach out to the roses. You could go after your rose bushes with these, the same tools you use on your hedges at pruning time, but I wouldn't do that if I were you, if I were growing modern roses for blooms all summer long. For those, you need pruning shears, a saw, and some loppers. Come with me. When I started growing roses, nothing frightened me as much as the thought of pruning them. Now I want to make it easy for you. The bush we're going to work on here is Queen Elizabeth. She's a vigorous grandiflora, and although we're going to give her only a moderate pruning, we're going to remove half her wood. We're also going to ask Bob to give us a hand. Before you take a step toward a rose bush in need of pruning, make sure first that you have a pair of clean, heavy-duty, sharp pruning shears. Begin removing all the twiggy growth at the top of a bush, growth that you know must come out. That also affords you the opportunity to see the center of the bush where you have to make judicious cuts. Now that all the top twiggy growth is gone, your next job is to remove the growth in the center of the bush that interferes with good air circulation. If canes happen to be growing in a place where it's difficult to get to with pruners or with loppers, then you have no choice but to use a pruning saw like the one Bob is about to use to remove this cane. Now that the center of the bush is a bit more open, I believe Bob can get his loppers in to remove the other canes that have to come out from the center of the bush. You can cut through this one, can't you? Now that the center of the bush is almost clear, we have only one cane still left as interference. I believe you can get this one also with your loppers. Once the center of the bush is clear, you should turn your attention to dead wood. This cane has lived long past its prime and isn't going to produce anything exciting this next year. It should all come out. Great. The final pruning cuts are all made with shears, and they are the ones that determine the eventual height of a pruned rose bush. The landmark that you want to look for is a budding eye facing outward from the center of the bush. Make all cuts about 1/4 inch above them. Bob is going to look for those around the canes on the outside of the bush.
So go ahead and take this one off entirely?
Yeah, I think it should come off. It's puny. Down to there, I think that's okay. That's a good height too. It's also facing out from the center of the bush. I would take this off because it's interfering with the interior growth. I can't tell. I think there's an eye right here. I'd cut it a little higher, maybe there. This one over here, there's a healthy eye. This one's pretty thick. That should come out because it's in the center of the bush. And then the next, well, here's a good budding eye, and that's also pointing in a direction where it'd be good to have some growth. Here, I'll hold it. This one you can get with shears. No, we'll save that till last. Here's one over here, and there's a great eye coming out there. I'd take this off because it's facing the wrong way. And then maybe prune to this one here that's clearly obvious.
Not too high?
Not too high.
What about this one?
Well, that doesn't look too promising. I think maybe the whole thing should be sacrificed and concentrate all the energy into here. This is what we at Garden Valley Ranch consider to be a well-pruned grandiflora rose bush. It looks a little bleak now, but wait till you see it this summer. Here it is 3 months later. It's hard to believe, isn't it? Let's recap the 4 basic steps to good pruning with these graphics. If you and Mother Nature didn't remove all foliage 2 weeks before pruning, get rid of it now. Next, remove all twiggy top growth. Then, take out dead wood and any wood that crosses the center of the bush. Look for swelling dormant eyes facing outward from the center of the bush and make cuts 1/4 inch above them. This is what a well-pruned rose bush should look like. If you worry that little seems left, rest assured you'll be rewarded in spring. We're going to talk about the latest introduction to rosedom now, landscape roses. And we're beginning with a terrific one, Bonica. Some people say Bonica. Bonica was the first rose to win an All-America award, and it did that in 1987. I liked landscape roses the first time I saw them, but I didn't think they held much promise for me as a commercial cut flower. Still, I admired the growth habits. Just at that time, I noticed this empty tree stump and decided to really put a landscape rose to its test. It's grown here since 1987. I've never sprayed it, and I've never pruned it. In the fall, it produces a magnificent crop of hips, and I think you'll agree the first flush of bloom is nothing to sneer at either. We're going to talk now about Sally Holmes. Sally Holmes is a terrific shrub rose that was hybridized by an amateur in England. From a distance, when the bushes are in full bloom, they look like rhododendron because there is a massive collection of single blossoms on the end of each stem. Sally Holmes is also a fine rose to consider for gardening because it will do exactly what you want it to do. If you like a climber, you can train it up a wall or a trellis. If you want a fountainous shrub, it will happily oblige. Sparrow's Hoop is another terrific shrub rose. It was hybridized by the Cordes clan in Germany. And true to its heritage, full-grown bushes get to be about the size of Volkswagens. Anytime a visitor comes to the ranch and tells us that they want to know the name of a pink rose out there that looked like a large apple blossom, we know they're talking about Sparrow's Hoop. The shrub roses we've talked about all happen to be large ones, but you should be aware that there are some fine shrub roses that are ideal for smaller gardens as well. If there weren't a host of diseases and insects out there to disfigure your roses, we could skip this part of the show and stick with the fun stuff. But they're there all right, and as long as they are, you should get to know what they look like. Of the diseases, I'm only going to talk about the big 3, mildew, rust, and black spot. Powdery mildew can affect all parts of the rose bush, stems and buds, but particularly foliage. Rust looks exactly like its name would imply. In the early stages, tiny pustules form on the undersides of leaves, but if the disease is allowed to go unchecked, they will eventually defoliate a bush. Black spot begins on the front of leaves, but eventually it will work its way through to the backside. Here's an example of foliage that is an advanced stage of black spot. Of the horde of insects out there ready to devour your roses, and there are too many of them for me to mention, there are some notorious ones that you need to stay on the prowl for. The first are aphids. They'll also be the first to come calling in late spring, early summer. Aphids are absolutely disgusting little insects that are capable of taking all the moisture out of rosebuds. Then, by August, you need to stay on the watch for spider mites. You know when spider mites are around when you notice soft cobwebs at the bottoms of bushes. Spider mites are microscopic, but they have bionic appetites. If any exotic diseases or pests come to your garden, the best thing to do is to consult with your local agricultural agent or a nearby nursery. But enough of the problems. Let's get back to the fun stuff. Now we're talking about a distinctly separate group of roses, the David Austin English roses. David Austin is a hybridizer who works in Albrighton, England, and he has achieved what hybridizers have hoped to achieve for years, and that is to combine the best elements of the modern roses, their ability to repeat their blossoms over an extended period, with those of the old-fashioned roses, known for their wonderful form and fragrance. This particular variety is Graham Stuart Thomas, named after the most famous rosarian in Britain. And now if I can make my way through this jungle, I'd like to show you another famous Austin rose, Leander, which grows particularly tall and is a lovely shade of apricot. This is another David Austin variety called Ellen. Ellen not only has wonderful color, but irresistible form. Another David Austin variety is Mary Rose. Mary Rose has the wonderful quality of always being the first to bloom each season. In rose language, deadheading means the removal of dead blossoms. In addition to making your rose bushes look much better, there's a more important reason you should deadhead, as Bob will explain as he shows you how to go about it.
The reason why deadheading is so important is that until you can get a new flower, you've got to remove the old one. The first thing we'll talk about when deciding where to cut to remove the old blossom, the rule is that you count from the bottom of the stem upward, and you count where the dormant eyes are, and the dormant eyes are right at the top of where the leaf comes out. Besides the actual act of deadheading, removing the old blossom from the bush, the next thing you need to decide is where you're going to cut it. The rule of thumb is that you cut the stem at the second set of 5 leaflets pointing to the outside of the bush. Usually at the bottom of the stem, the first set of leaflets will normally have just three leaves, like this one here is a great example. And from there you count up to the second set of 5 leaflets, which in this case is this one. The problem about this set of leaflets is that the new growth is going to be pointing into the center of the bush. So what I would do is go ahead and break my rule and come up to the next set of 5 leaflets and cut the stem here. When you have a lot of roses to deadhead, sometimes it's a little hard using the regular shears because you've got to put down your basket, get a hold of the stem, cut it. One of the things that I use is a pair of shears called cut and holds. They have a little lip on the edge of the cutting blade that actually holds the stem in place when you deadhead it. And I'll show you how that works. Just like that, which keeps your hands free to put the dead rose right into your basket. Besides using the cut and hold shears, another thing that I find very helpful when deadheading is the use of the proper gloves. These particular types of gloves are called gauntlet gloves, and they have an extra bit of rawhide leather material sewed onto the glove itself, which actually protects the forearm, while you're cutting from all those nasty thorns.
Now we're going to talk about some old roses. The oldest of roses, of course, are the species roses, and even the most conservative estimates place them on Earth at least 20 million years ago. Species roses have only one bloom each year, either in late spring or early summer. This one is Rosa eglanteria. The eglantine rose is known not only for its pretty flowers that appear in early summer, but also because its foliage smells exactly like green apples. Species roses are those roses you see wild growing in the countryside or along hedgerows, and because of that, they are not good selections for the average gardener. They get to be very large, their shrubs have open, lax habits, and they don't fit into most gardens. About the time of the Renaissance, people started taking roses more seriously, and hybridizers began mixing pollen to come up with new varieties. Hence, several families emerged. The first of these families, and generally recognized as the oldest family of roses, are the Gallicas. This bush in front of me, this bloom that I'm holding, is Rosa Gallica officinalis, also known as the apothecary rose. This rose, the striped one, is called Rosamundi, and it is actually a sport of Rosa gallica officinalis. A sport is a spontaneous mutation that Mother Nature simply throws our way. Later in the evolution of roses, especially when Josephine assembled the largest collection of roses in the world at Malmaison, roses were brought in from China that had the enviable ability to repeat their bloom over a season. They were then mixed with the roses that had only one bloom each year, and certain hybrids and families emerged. One of them is the Portland family of roses that is nicely shown here with Jacques Cartier. Another family of roses that came along once Josephine had her way with pollen from repeat blooming roses are the moss roses, characterized by mossy growth on all of their parts. This one happens to be Henri Martin. It's a fine moss rose of a vivid deep color. I think it's also nicely complemented by this row of Nicotiana at the back. When I first started growing roses, I wanted nothing but them in the garden. Later, I came to understand that certain annuals and perennials make fine companion plants. They look nice on their own, and they also flatter the roses. Here we have some mallows about to begin. I always include Artemisia because of their wonderful complementary foliage. Here is a stand of Lychnis that looks very nice next to Rosamundi. And in the foreground are the first salvias of the year to bloom. Here at Garden Valley Ranch, we never take buckets of water out into the garden to cut the roses. And I suggest you don't either. You'll inevitably just end up sloshing it on your feet. Instead, if you just take out a basket and cut them dry from the bush, what we'll show you in a few minutes, recutting their stems underwater, is the secret to getting the most life out of a rose blossom. Although we here at Garden Valley Ranch process thousands of roses every day, the way we do it is precisely the way you should at home. First, we cut the roses in the garden with no water in sight. Then we bring them indoors and arrange them by variety. The next step, the single most important in processing roses, is recutting stems underwater. Rose stems should be dipped into a container of water, and 1/4 inch of each stem should be cut off underwater. This keeps air bubbles from forming. When rose stems are recut underwater, they're sealed.
Bob, these are varieties under consideration for All America Roses 4 years from now. What do you think of these colors?
Like this one.
Nice red.
Yeah.
This is good for a spray rose, good in a landscape. Yeah, this yellow one is terrific. Look at that color. No, I don't believe so. I think some of actually his best ones are in the trials for next year. But this is a winning color, yeah. You know, there's really not a lot of difference between growing roses for a living and growing them at home. If you follow the advice we offer in this video, you can grow roses as wonderful as these in the test garden, or as fine as those that we cut and ship all over the country. I admit that roses take a little patience and often a lot of effort, but once they grab your heart, they don't let go. What do you think of this rose, Bob?